This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 1002 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by DraftKings. Thanks for tuning in. Football season's right around the corner, and there's no better way to lock in your fantasy dominance early than with Best Ball on DraftKings, where you draft once and ride your roster all season long. And right now, DraftKings is giving all customers a can't-miss offer. Draft one, get one. Enter a lineup in the $15 million Best Ball contest for just $20, and you'll score another Best Ball ticket to play free for a share of $15 million, giving you a second shot to win big. It's easy. Just draft your dream team once, no weekly management required, and let your top scorers automatically start each week. Across the whole season, every breakout star, every clutch play, every touchdown will count towards your quest for a share of $15 million. As you know, I'm drafting over there and I'm documenting things with becoming a Best Ball bro. So you can use the information from that show to help you out as well. So download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app now to draft your $20 Best Ball lineup to play for a share of $15 million and get a second ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million. That's two chances to win big without ever setting your lineup again. Draft one, get one, only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY to 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. One per customer. Enter the Best Ball $15 million headliner contest by 9/4/25 to get one bonus entry. $20 entry required. Reward expires in 30 days. See terms at DraftKings.com/NFL-best-ball. Sponsored by DK. We're now officially within the standard late round podcast schedule. What I mean by that is, each year around this time, I do the same episodes, just with new content. Like this one, this is one where I talk about regression candidates. Next week, we're doing early season schedule analysis, and then players to target, players to avoid, and so on. Which means everything is planned out right now through the end of fantasy season, which is kind of crazy to think about. But as I said, today's episode is about regression candidates. To me, regression is probably the most important concept to wrap your head around in fantasy football. And I still think that it's one that people don't totally understand. When we talk regression, it doesn't always automatically mean bad. It doesn't mean that some player is getting worse. It just means that a player has some average, some mean, that he's likely to perform closer to. If you play golf and you typically shoot in the low 90s and you have a round of 85, you don't just expect to shoot an 85 the next time that you're on the course. You're expecting to go back to your average, your mean of 90 to 95. You just got a little lucky and you shot an 85. You didn't actually get better. With fantasy and football in general, something we have to separate is the fact that a player can perform just as well on a real football field while getting better or worse in fantasy football. Because at the end of the day, fantasy scoring doesn't match real football. An 80-yard pass that doesn't result in a touchdown from a quarterback, it's worth less than a 1-yard touchdown throw, even though that 80-yard pass is likely way more impactful. Numbers fluctuate, and sometimes, a lot of times, it doesn't have anything to do with the actual skill level of a certain player. So on today's show, I'm going to talk through a handful of regression candidates, players, and in some cases, teams who did some weird and unsustainable stuff last year statistically. And since the market is likely going to use previous season numbers to project here in the current season, there may be an opportunity to target or avoid these players as a result of regression. So without further ado, let's get to the first candidate. I think one of the best examples of regression this year is at quarterback. And it's not Jared Goff, who I've talked about a lot this offseason. I think there's probably a better example in Baker Mayfield. Now look, I'm a borderline Baker Mayfield stan. I liked him coming out. I've always been kind of an apologist. But my job is to be objective. And being objective leads me to say that Baker Mayfield is going to regress this year. An easy way to spot that is just look at touchdown rate. Good quarterbacks will typically have higher touchdown rates, but it's still a number that regresses to the middle or to the mean. Baker Mayfield's touchdown rate last year was 7.2%. That's like 3 percentage points higher than the league's average. That resulted in Baker throwing 41 touchdowns, 13 more than his previous season in Tampa Bay, which came in 2023. He's never had a season like he had last year. Now, people are going to hear this and they're going to say, but Baker not only had injured pass catchers last year, they also added to that room this year. How could he possibly get worse? Well, here's the thing. Most regression-related statistics with quarterbacks are going to stem from the team level because quarterbacks control so much of the game. So if they're doing weird things, then something's probably going on at that team level. And for Tampa Bay, that's exactly the case. Two things happened for the Buccaneers last year. Number one, they were fourth in touchdowns per game at 3.35 touchdowns per contest. Number two, 72% of their touchdowns came via the pass. Now think about this. For a high passing touchdown total to happen, a team will have to score a lot of touchdowns and then also see a lot of those touchdowns come via the air. One of those two things at least has to happen. There have been 13 teams since 2011 who had 3.25 touchdowns per game or more, while seeing at least 70% of those touchdowns come via the air. The Buccaneers are one of those teams, and they're the only team that did it last year. That means we have 12 teams who have next season data. Of those 12 teams, guess how many ended up seeing an improvement in passing touchdowns year over year? One of them did, and funny enough, only the 2020 Bucs from 2020 to 2021 saw an uptick in passing touchdowns, going from 42 to 43. That was when they had Tom Brady. The average team lost 9.7 passing touchdowns. And yes, some of these teams were even bigger regression candidates than Mayfield and the Bucs. I'm not saying he's a lock to throw 10 fewer touchdowns, but I don't think that's even close to out of the range of outcomes here. My projections have him around 32. Mike Clay, the gold standard for projection building, has him at 33. Mayfield ran the ball more last year, and he was more effective as a rusher in fantasy. So if that does stick, if that rushing component sticks, he may be able to maintain his ADP expectation. Now, I have my doubts personally of that, which is why I'm more on the avoid side than the target side with Baker Mayfield. But regression should hit, even with the Emeka Egbuka in the picture. Mayfield can play just as well as he did last year in real football while still regressing statistically. That's how regression works. We shouldn't simply expect greatness. And the Buccaneers, they were pretty great last year. Now we talked some team level regression with Mayfield, and I want to shift to another NFC team and look at the Eagles, because their 2024 was absolutely wild with how they ran their offense. The Eagles were really run heavy last year. And when I say really run heavy, I mean extremely run heavy. Their 41.9% pass rate, and that's on attempts for the record, but that 41.9% pass rate wasn't just the lowest in the league. It was the second lowest since 2011. We've only had 7 teams with next season data hit a sub 45% pass rate. The Eagles were way lower than that. Not only did all but one of them increase that pass rate the following year, but the average increase in pass rate from those teams has been 7 percentage points. In games where he accounted for 90% or more of the team's pass attempts, Jalen Hurts averaged just 25.5 pass attempts per game last year. The year before that, that number was almost 33. Before that, it was 31. We can sit here and say that the Eagles are good, that they're going to be run heavy, and that Saquon Barkley changed the dynamic of that offense. I wouldn't even disagree with that. But it's really hard to sustain such a low pass rate. Not only that, but the Eagles have one of the 5 toughest schedules this year when viewing opponents through the lens of win totals. They might trail in games this year more than they did last year, and that would result in more passing. So this means that we should expect to see more passing volume in this offense, and that's going to help the pass catchers. It doesn't mean Saquon Barkley's dust. But I think we'd all agree that regression is likely going to hit Saquon Barkley on the volume front. I sent a newsletter about this last week, but among players with 300 or more carries in year end since 2011, there have been 24 of them with next season data. The average player tends to lose a few rush attempts per game. So expect the Eagles to throw the ball more here in 2025. Now, I've talked about Terry McLaurin throughout the offseason, but he's one of the more obvious regression candidates this year at wide receiver. McLaurin scored 13 times last year after having scored 4 or 5 touchdowns in each of his 4 seasons prior. And it's not like his target share dramatically changed, or even his per route run numbers. His yards per route run was just a little bit better than his career average last year, and his target share per game rate was 23.3%. He'd been above that in 3 other NFL seasons. McLaurin accounted for 44.8% of Washington's passing touchdowns last year. He scored 13 of their 29 passing touchdowns. Not only was that by far the highest of his career, but if you take a look at the players who have been over the 40% mark since 2011, and you look at the guys who have been able to repeat that mark, it's basically elite touchdown scorer after elite touchdown scorer. Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Brandon Marshall, Dez Bryant. Now, DJ Moore is actually on that list too, but that's simply because he played on teams with such few passing touchdowns. There's more variance with a guy like Moore. And by the way, since 2011, we've had 34 instances where a wide receiver accounted for 40% or more of their team's passing touchdowns. The average target share among those players was close to 27%. That's 4 percentage points higher than where Terry McLaurin was at. We can sit here and say that Washington will simply score more touchdowns this year, resulting in McLaurin having more opportunity to score, aka he can take a hit in touchdown share and still do fine. And while I recognize that's still a possibility, we also have to recognize that the Commanders' offense was very good last year, and there's more competition for McLaurin. So regression is likely coming for Scary Terry. Best ball drafts seem to be accounting for that a bit. We definitely can't assume he's going to be nearly as good in fantasy year over year. Now, on the running back front, one of the more obvious players there is James Cook. Pro Football Focus has their expected touchdowns formula, which tells you how many touchdowns you'd expect a player to have given his usage and where he's seeing touches. And when you look at that for James Cook, he was expected to score 11.6 touchdowns last year. He scored 18. That was the second biggest overperformance in the game. Buffalo was actually one of 2 teams last year, the Eagles being the other one, who had more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns. That's happened 28 times prior to last year and since 2011. Of those 28 teams the following year, 25 of them saw that pass to rush touchdown ratio increase. And of the teams who saw a decrease, that decline was by less than a percentage point. The average increase among those teams has been 13%. Meaning the Bills saw about 48% of their touchdowns last year come via the air. Very quick math based on the average increase that we've seen from these teams. And this isn't the most precise way to do this for the record, but it is a way to do this. But that 13% number would mean that this year, Buffalo would see a 61% pass to rush touchdown rate instead of a 48% one. And if that's the case, if they scored the exact same number of offensive touchdowns, we're looking at the potential for 8 fewer rushing touchdowns. Now, that can obviously hurt Josh Allen, but he'd also be throwing those touchdowns that are being converted to passing scores. James Cook is not going to be throwing them. So it's a little bit scary for Cook entering 2025. But another running back that I want to call out here is a guy who outperformed in the touchdown column even more than James Cook did. And everyone is rightfully pointing to Cook and screaming regression. But what about Jahmyr Gibbs? Now, this is not to say that you should fade Gibbs, because there's a scenario and there's an out for him this year where the Lions just use David Montgomery less. And that would be insane for Jahmyr Gibbs' fantasy value. But strictly from a regression standpoint, Gibbs did outperform expectation in the touchdown column according to PFF's formula by 6.8 scores. He's an insane player, so he's going to probably outplay that expectation most seasons. But 6.8 is not insignificant. And I don't know if we can simply project and expect another season of 5.7 yards per carry. So I still have Gibbs ranked very high and at ADP because he's done incredible things without having a serious bell cow workload. Imagine a world where that actually happens on the volume front. But I think there's a wider range of outcomes for a player like Gibbs compared to alternatives in the draft like Bijan Robinson. You just got to go with what you're most comfortable with. Now, I talked about the Eagles and their run-heavy ways last year, but the Packers, they were also guilty of being more run-heavy than anyone expected. Matt LaFleur has coached the Packers for 6 seasons. During his first 5, his teams averaged a pass rate of 56.3%. Those teams had a pass rate over expected below 0 in just one of those seasons. Last year, Green Bay's pass rate was just 47.7%. Their pass rate over expected, minus 8.3%. Now, part of that was Jordan Love maybe not being 100%. Malik Willis got a couple of starts. Josh Jacobs joined the team. All of that. But it wasn't a normal season for the Packers. If you look at teams who have been in the 46 to 50% pass rate range since 2011, the vast majority of them see an uptick in pass rate the following year. Of the 36 with next season data, only 6 of them dropped in pass rate in that N+1 season. And the vast majority of them increased that pass rate by 3 percentage points or more. So if we anticipate the Packers being more pass heavy, that'll obviously help the passing attack and potentially downgrade Josh Jacobs. Where I'm worried with Jacobs is close to the end zone. Last season, no player in football had more goal line carries. He was at 22. We average 2 to 3 running backs per year getting 20 or more goal line attempts. So we can't just assume that those carries carry over. Green Bay had the 5th most rush attempts at the goal line last year, and they were bottom 10 at the goal line in pass rate. We could see some of that go to the passing attack. Now, the Packers are really easy to stack in best ball. And while I don't think Jordan Love is something that you need to reach for in your season-long leagues because he's a pocket passer, it wouldn't be surprising to me at all if he outplays ADP this year. It's unfortunate that they rotate their wide receivers the way that they do, but it's not like any of those wide receivers are super costly in drafts. So I'm overall very in on this Packers passing attack. Now, extending this Packers discussion, let's talk about Tucker Kraft. So full disclosure, I think Tucker Kraft, he's a draft target this year. He's an ascending talent. There's ambiguity with the pass catchers. He's the right kind of bet to make in my eyes. With that being said, he did some really funky things last year. Specifically, according to PFF data, he had a yards after the catch per reception rate of 9.3. In 2024, 30 tight ends had 50 or more targets. Tucker Kraft led all of them in yards after the catch per reception. The player in second was George Kittle. George Kittle had a yak per reception of 6.6, nearly 3 yards less than Tucker Kraft. So Kraft, as a result, outpaced his fantasy points per game expectation by 2.5 points per game. That's according to PFF's formula. Now, the reason I think we can still be in on him is essentially improvement as a player, but more importantly, betting on him getting higher than a 15% target share. And if he gets higher than a 15% target share, that's on more passing volume. He was a solid prospect, he has the right athleticism markers, and he's shown that off in the NFL. He's in an offense that should throw the ball more this year, and it's an offense with question marks at pass catcher. Just know that there is some regression coming his way. Now, I'm going to end today's show with a fairly obvious regression candidate, but it's one where we can have a little bit of fun when projecting his ceiling. And it's Trey McBride. The dude had 2 receiving touchdowns last year, and he now has 6 touchdowns on 292 career NFL targets. I mean, look, maybe Trey McBride is just really bad at finding the end zone. His final season at Colorado State literally saw him catch 90 balls and he scored once. He only had 10 touchdowns during his 4 years in college on 164 catches. Now, it's not to say that McBride, a physical freak of nature who's one of the best tight ends in the game, it's not to say that he can't find the end zone. I'm not being totally serious. I think there's at least some variance to all of this. Last year, McBride was dead last in the league, or first in the league, depending on how you want to look at it, in underperforming his expected touchdowns. That's across all positions. According to PFF's numbers, he should have had about 9 touchdowns. He had 3, and that's total touchdowns because he did have a rushing score. He only had 2 receiving touchdowns when he was expected to have 8.5. Over the last 15 years, tight ends have scored a touchdown on average on every 133 receiving yards. That's the average across the league. We're including dudes here like Johnny Munt, O.J. Howard, Mercedes Lewis. It's every tight end. Trey McBride is obviously better than the average tight end. McBride scored a touchdown last year on every 573 receiving yards. Had he scored 6 more touchdowns like his expected touchdown total said, he would have then scored 36 more points across the season. That's over 2 more points per game. Had he done that, then McBride would have been around 17.7 PPR points per game. That's a number that's been matched just 9 times since 2011. Now, I'm not saying that you have to draft Trey McBride. there's game theory, and there's an opportunity cost associated with drafting him. What I am saying is that his upside is pretty insane if he's able to see the exact same role that he saw last year. Now, clearly that might change, but you at least know that you're getting a pretty great floor with him. Now, clearly there are other regression candidates that we could have talked through today, but I wanted a good mix of individual player and team level ones to get you thinking about the topic. I talked through a wide variety of examples, and hopefully it made you think differently about some teams and players here in 2025. But that's it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. I've got Becoming a Best Ball Bro hitting your feeds tomorrow, and then another Perspectives episode later in the week. I'll talk to you soon.